and he has by no means praise for anyone doing what they want to do. After all, how can anyone not do what they want to do? That's the premise. But rather, there are certain ways of desiring, and there are certain kinds of ambitions, there are certain kinds of drives that are more noble and better than others. And for the master, what simply drives his or her behavior is the idea of doing what he or she wants, where what he or she wants is ideally to be conceived of as being the best. And being the best as a person, being the best as a citizen, being the best as an artist, being the best as a warrior, or whatever. The truth is that when Nietzsche talks about master morality, one might say there isn't all that much to talk about. Because if morality simply consists of doing what you want to do, and what you want to do should be as virtuous, as excellent as possible, and if we're talking about individuals who have different talents and consequently different virtues, different excellences, there's very little by way of a positive ethics or a positive morality with a small m that one can provide. And that's why Nietzsche often says in many of his works, just not, I'm going to tell you what to do, but quite to the contrary. He says, find your own way. Zarathustra in a famous passage says, don't follow me, find your own way. There's an etymology behind this as well. Just as Cathy said that one finds the origins of slave morality, not in the days when, for example, Israel was a mighty nation. King Solomon, no doubt, was just as much of a tyrant, did just as many awful things as the leaders of other great civilizations of the ancient world. But it's when the Hebrews were in exile, when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. That's where what we call morality with a capital M starts its origins. Or in the early Christian days when Christians were by no means the rulers in Rome, but they were being persecuted right and left and so on. That's where it comes from. So slave morality has to be conceived of as a kind of reaction. And Cathy will talk more about that in a moment. A reaction to master morality in particular. The idea of people who can just do what they want. In fact, the very word good, Nietzsche suggests, comes from an ancient root, which basically means warrior. And it has to do with a kind of what Aristotle, not the later Christians, would call pride, a sense of being great-souled, a sense of self-confidence, or these days I suppose we might say very high self-esteem. The model of excellence, I mean, what could it be except oneself? This is what people should be. In a very funny play, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. There's a very obnoxious Roman general there who sings a song which goes, basically, I am my own ideal. That is master morality. It's not taking instructions from outside, even if, of course, masters are going to be part of a possibly very long tradition. It's not going to be taking instructions from God, and it's certainly not going to be simply obeying a set of prohibitions. But rather, it's going to be pursuing a sense of excellence which is very much one's own, and that's what the word good means. By contrast, the word bad is its opposite. Bad refers to failure, bad refers to weakness, bad refers to pathos, what's pathetic, bad refers to what's vulgar, what's low class, what is not the best, what is unsatisfying. So you might look at the difference between master and slave morality here, both of them following the basic premise of human behavior. People do what they want to do. The difference is masters accept that, follow it straightforwardly, and their ideal is to be the best that they can be. Whereas those who are not masters, those who are slaves, follow the opposite premise. Don't do what you want to do. Don't try to do what you want to do because you'll only be frustrated. So what they want to do, in a way, is to compensate for that inability to do what they really want to do, and slave morality comes from that.
One of the rather interesting features of Nietzsche's use of the expression good and evil is that he thinks that very dichotomy is a matter that's born of slave morality. If you think about the situation Bob just described, the master doesn't question anything about his or her, usually his, situation. The master is simply filled with self-assertion. There's no reason to question that the way they live is good. On the other hand, for people that became enslaved, there was certainly a reason to doubt their own status. They didn't have any external political status. And if you think about the way the ancient Hebrews dealt with the situation, there are many aspects of the Hebrew Bible, many discussions about what have we done wrong? How could this have happened to us? It led to a great deal of self-questioning. Nietzsche thinks in that context, actually, what the slaves did in developing slave morality was a step in the right psychological direction. He comments, the slave revolt morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, what it means is that the slaves developed their morality by virtue of being resentful. Pretty obvious who they resent. They resent the people who have enslaved them. They resent the masters, who can go around being obnoxious as they feel like without even questioning it themselves. And the slave revolt in morals comes when they make that observation. The way the masters are isn't good in itself. In fact, it isn't even very self-controlled. The way the masters are, what the masters assert to be good, the slaves come to view with skepticism. In fact, they end up concluding that it's evil. Even were they in the position of the masters, they imagine, they wouldn't want to act that way. The way the masters behave is not something to admire. Indeed, it's something to despise. And if that's the case, what are they by contrast? Well, as slaves, they're certainly not acting like the masters. And by contrast with the sense that the masters are evil, they can view themselves as good. But notice, this is exactly the reverse of the way the masters evaluate things. The masters see themselves as good without question. Therefore, they see people who are different from them, probably the slaves most obviously, as bad. So Nietzsche views the dichotomy good and bad as something that goes with master evaluations, whereas good and evil comes from the position of the slaves evaluating as slaves. And they reverse who's good. The masters view themselves as good without question. The slaves have to conclude that they're good. They're already in a position of questioning their status, their own morality. And they have to conclude that they're good only on the basis of having seen someone else as worse than themselves. And in this case, it's the masters that they view this way. So what good amounts to from their point of view is not asserting yourself in the kind of direct way that the masters do. It involves having more self-control. Of course, their political position almost ensures that they will have developed some ability in this regard. They view the masters as people who haven't learned these kinds of traits, who haven't learned to be so clever, who haven't learned to be devious, who haven't learned to internally disrespect what externally they might go along with. And that kind of internal move on the part of the slaves Nietzsche views as a kind of brilliant bit of psychology. The problem is, it later ends up becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that always puts the slave in a kind of secondary position. There is no immediate sense of self-worth without there first having to be a view that someone else is evil.
One can think of this, and let's give it a name, transvaluation of values, a term which Nietzsche uses actually quite frequently.